Hi, in this lesson, we'll be going over the commonalities and differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, as well as the various organelles and their jobs. To start with, I want to have a reminder for the 3 parts of cell theory. Remember, cell theory states that all cells, number 1, make up all living things. 2, are the basic unit of structure and function. And 3, come from old cells dividing to create new cells. All cells, both prokaryotic and eukaryotic, have certain structures. They all have a cell membrane. They all have DNA as their genetic material. They all have ribosomes to make proteins. And they all have cytoplasm, which is the medium that all the organelles and all the other cell parts float in. For the most part, cells are microscopic. And just as a couple examples, there are some cells that are bigger than microscopic. First is a species that is called Valonia ventricosa, which is simply, it's a type of algae. It's an algae that grows in the ocean somewhere. But as you can clearly see, this is much larger than something we'd expect to be a single cell. It is definitely not microscopic. It's something that we can hold in our hand and actually see without a microscope. Another example is what we call an ovum, or an egg. Humans, if we were to harvest a female's eggs, they can actually be seen without a microscope. But stuff like chicken eggs, ostrich eggs, if they are unfertilized, those are still a single cell. So those are much, much bigger than what we think of as being a cellular size. Cells all have or contribute to the characteristics of life. I mentioned all the way at the beginning of class are those 8 characteristics. Cells exhibit all of those characteristics because they are the basis of life. So they're going to have all of the characteristics of life. So before we get into it, I do want to talk about a couple of terms. Number 1 is this term organelle. And we've talked about this a couple of times in class. But as a reminder, organelles are specialized structures that perform all of the various cell functions. So anything that a cell does, it does with some type of organelle. And we have 2 main types of cells. We have prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Starting with prokaryotic. As with most scientific words, we can break down the term prokaryotic to its roots, with pro meaning before, karyon meaning kernel. What this refers to, that kernel is the nucleus of a cell. So prokaryotic cells are cells that don't have a nucleus. In addition to a few other things, they don't have anything that we call a membrane-bound organelle. This is stuff like mitochondria, chloroplast, endoplasmic reticulum, on and on and on. The prokaryotic cells, one of their main things that identifies them is the fact that their DNA is just kind of free-floating in their cytoplasm. There's nothing that contains it. It's just kind of there. In addition, they are much, much smaller and much less complex than eukaryotic cells. They only have a handful of organelles, and they are able to do all the functions that they need to do with those few things or just within the cell itself. They don't have any of the specialized structures that we know. Prokaryotic cells are only single-celled organisms. They will never be multicellular. there will be communities of multiple single cells, but they won't build an organism the way that we are built off of multiple cells or that other animals are built off of multiple cells. They will always be just these individual organisms that just kind of clump together. They're still individual things, just as a group. And getting into... We're not going to talk about kingdoms just yet, or the classifications of life, but to give you a couple of the terms. Prokaryotic cells are only in the kingdoms of bacteria and archaea. And we'll talk about what that means later. Lastly, prokaryotics are the most plentiful organisms on the planet. In any handful of soil, there will be more bacteria than there are humans that have existed. Bacteria are just simply that plentiful. So, eukaryotic cells, eukaryotes, these are the other type of cell in life. Just like with prokaryotes, we can break them down into their roots and prefixes. With EU, meaning true, and once again, karyon, meaning kernel. Once again, referring to a nucleus. So it's saying eukaryotes have a true nucleus. Eukaryotic cells, unlike prokaryotes, do have a cell membrane. Scratch that. They do have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. The DNA of these cells are contained within that nucleus. That is the main difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell, is eukaryotic cells have that nucleus that contains the DNA. So, these cells are much, much larger and much more complex than prokaryotic cells are. This is because that they have more stuff going on inside them. They have all these various organelles, all these various functions that they do, which tends to make them much, much larger. And also, unlike prokaryotes, eukaryotes can either be single or multicellular organisms. So they can either be a single cell that can exist on its own, like a bacteria, or it's a compilation of cells and different types of cells that build a more complex organism. This is because of all the various organelles within them that allows them to become more specialized. And there are 4 main kingdoms that we're going to look at for this in the future. The kingdom of Protista, which is single-celled organisms like Paramecium, amoeba, and a few different algae. These can be either single or multicellular. The kingdom fungus, which can be different types of spores, yeasts, mushrooms, things like that. And once again, these can be single or multicellular. Plantae, plants, which are, plants. And Animalia, stuff like us, animals. So, starting to look at organelles, beginning with the nucleus. The nucleus is a special type of organelle. Remember that for us, DNA is the genetic code or blueprint for the organism, and that this is contained within the nucleus in prokaryotic cells. The nucleus is a membrane-enclosed structure in all eukaryotic cells that contains DNA. That is what that organelle is. And we can see the nucleus. It's highlighted in red in this microscope slide. Kind of the associated job with this is that it acts as the control center for the cell. And let me stress, I don't mean it's a brain. Cells don't think the way that you and I do. They don't make decisions, they don't interpret information. Instead, the control comes from the way that the nucleus makes proteins. It contributes to making proteins. It kind of regulates and decides how to do that. And that's how it controls what goes on in the cell. There are other parts to this, including the nuclear membrane, which is the membrane. It surrounds the nucleus. It separates the nucleus and the DNA from the rest of the cell. And in the center is a very dense structure called the nucleolus. We're not going to go too far into this, but the main job of the nucleolus, it is part of our DNA. This is the part of our DNA that makes ribosomes. And it's simple as that. The next set of organelles, moving on from the nucleus, are the organelles that are responsible for building and transporting proteins and other materials to where they need to go. We're going to talk about 3 different ones in this set. The first one being ribosomes. Ribosomes are responsible for actually assembling proteins in our cells. And these are found in all cells. These are actually not membrane-bound organelles. So these are something that is also found in bacteria. The job of a ribosome, as I said, was to actually build the protein that our cells and body needs. The more active the cell is, the more ribosomes that cell will have or need. The next organelle that I want to talk about is endoplasmic reticulum, or I'll simply call it ER. When proteins are being built, the endoplasmic reticulum will essentially act like a clean room. A sterile environment where there's nothing else in it, so it can be properly regulated. They're a place to where proteins and other materials can be built in an overall neutral environment. And this organelle comes in 2 types, smooth and rough. Rough ER is endoplasmic reticulum that has ribosomes attached to it. Rough ER helps to build the proteins that ribosomes are making. So it gives them that environment to, once they've started building the protein, they attach to the endoplasmic reticulum and continue to build it before they release it. The other type, smooth ER, has no ribosomes attached to it. Hence why it's called smooth. There's no bumps, there's nothing else on it. This type builds parts of the cell membrane and other materials. So parts of organelles and things like that. Lastly is the Golgi apparatus, or the Golgi bodies. Both terms are equally correct. Recently, they've been tending towards calling it the Golgi apparatus. So that's how I'm going to refer to it. This organelle acts like the post office for the cell. It modifies, sorts, and packages materials for transport either within or out of our cell. So I'm going to hold on for a second because I didn't click through to give you guys a second to catch up. Alright, so the next set of organelles that we're going to talk about are the organelles that store, clean, and just kind of overall support the cell in various ways. First, we have vacuoles and vesicles. These store and transport material within the cell. And on the screen, I have examples of animal vacuoles and the plant vacuole. The main difference between the two is that vacuoles store materials. So if there's a need for excess water or excess food or nutrients, these are stored within what we call vacuoles. Vesicles, on the other hand, vesicles transport material either within the cell or out of the cell. This is the actual thing that moves around and brings stuff where it needs to go. Before we move on to the next one, I want to address the animal cell versus the plant cell. Plant cells will have a single large vacuole because plants make their own food and they need a place to store it, along with storing water and a few other materials that kind of help give a plant cell additional support. Animal cells don't need that. Animal cells don't need that additional support, so they tend to have smaller, more temporary vacuoles, only storing stuff when they need to store it. So, moving on then, is our lysosomes. Lysosomes are small sacs that are filled with enzymes to help break down molecules into smaller pieces. And these kind of have two jobs. The jobs are very similar, but they're focused on other things. First is that they break things down into more usable pieces for the cell. So taking large molecules and breaking them down into their components that the cell can actually use. Second is that they also serve to break down junk, like old organelles or other waste material that the cell needs to get rid of or wants to get materials from. And these are mostly found in animal cells. A few are found in plant cells from time to time, but these are mostly part of animal cells. Next is the organelles that capture and release energy. I'm going to be very brief with this, just long enough to talk about them, because we are going to go into these two organelles in much greater detail in a later unit. The first is only found in plant cells. This is a chloroplast. The job of a chloroplast is to capture energy from sunlight and to store it or convert it into energy within food. So taking that sunlight energy and turning it into something that the cell will use. And this is the process that is called photosynthesis. And as I said, it's found in plants along with some other organisms. There's a lot of bacteria that actually does perform this function. It just doesn't have chloroplasts. And there are other cell types. There's some protists that perform photosynthesis with chloroplasts. So it's not just in plants, but plants are best known for it. And in the photo, the chloroplasts are the green circular structures within plants. The second organelle is what is called mitochondria. And I talked about this a little bit in class as well. Most people know this by the job that it's assigned. People call it the powerhouse of the cell because mitochondria will take food and break it down to get that chemical energy and turn it into something that is more usable for the cell. And this is a process that is called cellular respiration. And this organelle is found in almost all eukaryotic cells. There are some that don't have it, but for the most part, eukaryotic cells will have mitochondria because they all need energy. And like I said, this is what we refer to as the powerhouse of the cell. The last set is the two types of cell boundaries. The first is the cell membrane. The cell membrane is a thin, flexible barrier that surrounds the cell. Now, the same thing as I mentioned previously, I'm not going to go too far into this because actually the next lesson that we do is going to be focused on the cell membrane and what it does. The cell membrane, it can be seen here, is just the outer boundary of the cell. And its job is to support, protect, and regulate what comes in or goes out of the cell. Next is what we call the cell wall. The cell wall, its job is to support, shape, and protect the cell that it's around. This is much, much thicker than a cell membrane. So the plasma membrane or cell membrane is relatively thin, actually. The cell wall is about 5 or 6 times thicker. So, like I said, it's much, much thicker. And the analogy I used in class was kind of think of this like an overcoat. It doesn't replace the plasma membrane, but it adds protection and it adds additional support to it. So it gives us support, it gives us protection, but it's still somewhat porous, so it lets water and other materials pass through as it needs. And this is found in various different organisms. It's found in bacteria, fungus, plants, and a number of other cells. But it is not found in animal cells. Okay, well, that's all I have for you for this one. So, until next time, enjoy.